So,
well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
You have,
I appreciate those comments about our 4 members of this committee who have been members of this committee for some period of time. I know Mr. Polis is relatively new, but the other 3 are senior members having served with you for some period of time. And I hope that, and I think you bring in a degree of comedy that I think serves this committee well. And I want to thank you for your outreach to me after you became chairman, your willingness to work together. I thank this committee for the opportunity to participate. I must say at the outset, I've heard some comments here that I think emanate from a lack of knowledge of what the law is. The executive order the President sends down is pursuant to the law. It's not out of the air. It's pursuant to the law. Now, I know a little bit about the law because I sponsored it, the Federal Employee Pay Comparability Act in 1990. I worked with the Bush administration to forge that law. And what it was an attempt to come to some reasonable way to assess what would be the proper and comparable pay for federal employees. And when we talk about comparability, what we talk about is comparability to the private sector. Now, very frankly, as an off-the-cuff remark, because I don't have the specific numbers, but let me say to you that I believe that if you compare the private sector with the public sector, if at about a GS 10 or 11 and below, we probably compensate our people a little better than the private sector, and above that, we probably don't compensate them as well as the private sector. But when you talk on averages, what the Federal Employee Pay Comparability Act does, that as I point out to you was adopted in a bipartisan way, working with the OMB and OPM in the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, was it says, let's look at the private sector. And we use what is not the cost of living, but the economic cost index, which simply reflects the adjustment in private sector pay generally across the private sector. And it then says that federal employees will get paid comparably. Now, why did we say that comparably? Because although Mr. Nugent mentioned, I think, the sheriff's office, what clearly the federal government needs to do, because the federal government performs some extraordinarily important functions for the American people. And whether you like government or don't like government, if we're doing a function, it ought to be done well, and we ought to have competent, capable people to do that. And therefore, we need to recruit, and yes, we need to retain competent people. Whether you're playing baseball, or football, or you've got a sheriff's office, or you've got a congressional office, if you're not paying comparable wages, people aren't going to, over time, work for you because they're going to go to the best available opportunity for them. So in adopting the Federal Employee Pay Comparability Act, it was determined that we would pay comparable wages. There are a number of administrations, Democrat and Republican, since 1990 that I've had this discussion with say, well, this system doesn't work exactly right. So what I've said to them, okay, fine. Come up with a better system. I said that to the Clinton administration. I said it to the second Bush administration. If you don't like this system, you don't think it's right, come up with a better system. They haven't done it. And the reason they haven't done it, in my view, is because it will generally reflect the same thing that we find now, that there's a disparity. It won't be uniform. Different skill sets. The higher the skill set, probably the less pay that we pay in the federal service. But it's a general proposition. We said we want to stay even with this comparability, and that's what this comparability adjustment is. And the law says if the Congress doesn't set it, then the President can do it by executive order. So it's not just some magic. That's what the law says. It doesn't just come down out of the air. And so the President said, because we provided the CR, as the gentleman pointed out, only until March 27th, the freeze. We've now had a freeze for 2.5 years. That has cost federal employees approximately $75 billion. $75 billion reduction in what 3 years ago they would have anticipated making over the next 10 years. Understand that's a 10-year figure, when you add in the reduction for new employees in the pension system, it's about $103 billion that we have already done. Now, with all due respect to the sponsor of this legislation, he's a brand new member of Congress. As I understand it, he's a Harvard, Yale graduate and was a U.S. attorney last year, assistant U.S. attorney. I suggest you look at the salary of the U.S. attorney. He's received a pretty substantial raise this year. I appreciate that. This job is worth what we're paid. And I frankly have worked with your majority leaders or minority leaders over the years to try to make sure that members of Congress stay comparable. We'll work hard, every one of us. I may disagree with you or agree with you, but you work hard. This job is worth what we're paid. And I tell my constituents that. I frankly tell anybody in the United States who wants to ask me, if they don't think I'm worth it, they ought to get rid of me. I don't back up a single inch on what I'm paid. If I work in the private sector, I'd make 4 times as much as I'm making now. And you all know that. It's an important job we do. Now, there is a hostility towards government, but we ought not to have that hostility for government directed at those people we employ to do the services that we ask them to perform, whether they do it in the defense side or the non-defense side, whether they are food inspectors that try to make our food safe, whether they're researchers at the National Institute of Health, whether they're law enforcement officials in the FBI, whether they're on the front lines of our security and CIA, wherever those civilians may be. And some of them are at the point of the spear in harm's way. And they're getting killed. And we ask them to perform services for our country. And we've frozen them for 2.5 years. We are now saying that perhaps for the next half a year, they'll get a half a point. Yes, I understand they have step increases. Of course, members of Congress don't have step increases and shouldn't have. We all get paid equally. We all work hard. My observation has been some work harder than others, but our pay is all the same, as it should be. We can't make that distinction. So the first point I would make to you, and I would hope that you would understand how we got to these figures. It is because the private sector got these raises. Not every one of them. But when you analyze Department of Labor statistics on pay, practically 1.7% increase in the private sector. Actually, it's a little more than that. Now, all of you voted to give the military a 1.7% increase. I don't begrudge that. But I would suggest to you that some of our civilian folks who are not at the point of the spear because we pay the people in harm's way extra, as we should, hazardous duty pay. But some of our private sector people perform extraordinarily important functions in the Defense Department, in CIA, in DIA, in so many other agencies which make our defense establishment, the formal defense establishment, more able to conduct its functions which are critical. If we continue to demagogue federal employees, if we continue to use federal employees as a piñata, you're going to find that people aren't going to want to work for this government. They're going to say the government's not a good employer. The bosses, the board of directors doesn't like us. The board of directors continues to kick us around. The board of directors continues to use terms like bureaucrat as an epithet, not as a descriptive. And America will lose. Not the federal employees. I represent 62,000 federal employees, so you're not surprised that I'm here advocating for their interest. You didn't hear me mention boo when they were frozen for 2 years. As a matter of fact, at the White House with John Boehner sitting to my side, in 2009, I recommended that we freeze federal employees, and I met with all the unions. I said, look, America's having a tough time. We got to notch our belt in. We're taking a freeze. You didn't hear them say boo. They didn't write you a letter. They didn't demonstrate. They weren't on the street corners. Why? One of their representatives, me, who I think they probably believe is one of their strongest supporters over the last 30 years, said, everybody else is taking a hit. We need to take that hit too. But as I said, the law shows and BLS says we're getting better. We're coming back. And people are getting raises, 1.7%. All this is a half a point for half a year, which means essentially 2.5% annualized. So while this bill may sound good, and while it's easy to freeze ours, and I think we ought to freeze ours, Norman, I'm not for that. I've been adamantly opposed. And you notice in even our motions to recommit, when we go after members, I'm usually not there for our MTRs. Because I don't believe we ought to demagogue ourselves. I don't think we need sackcloth. I don't think we need to ride down the street beating ourselves on the back. I think we ought to stand up with pride and say, yeah, we've got gridlock because we have strong feelings on either side, but not because people aren't working hard. They are working hard. I think you represent the interests that sent you here as well, if not better than I represent the interests that sent me here. That's number one. Number two is we want to have an alternative to this sequester. This sequester is going to be very dangerous and harmful. I know there are a number of you who have spoken out on the Republican side that sequester is okay. Thank God that if we can't get it done any other way, let's just meat axe it. Mr. Cantor doesn't believe that's the case, said so on Meet the Press on Sunday. Mr. Boehner has said it's not the case. He doesn't like this. It's going to be harmful. It's going to be harmful to our national security. It's going to be harmful to our domestic security. I would urge you, I don't know whether Mr. Van Hollen is here yet, but I've got, by the way, a written statement I'll submit. The fact of the matter is Mr. Van Hollen has an alternative. It's a relatively small alternative because we're talking about just the short term for the sequester. I think we ought to do a big balanced deal for 10 years. I think that would be the best stimulus this Congress could pass. I think it would get confidence to business, confidence to consumers, confidence to America, and indeed confidence to the international community. So what I would urge twofold. First of all, reject the rejection of the half a point increase for federal employees to give them some indication that we value their service, that we respect their contribution. This is 2.5 years freeze. It's not like they've gotten away for free. It's $103 billion, $10 billion a year. They've taken a cut already in pay and benefits. That's not insignificant, I would suggest to you. And you ought to go back to tell your constituents, yes, we've constrained, yes, we've notched the belt in. We've taken $10.3 billion over the last 2.5 years. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this opportunity to some degree, I suppose, ramble, but to try to give you a little background on how we got here under the Federal Employee Pay Comparability Act of 1990, how we try to assess in a fair way, how we try to assess in a comparable way to our other constituents who aren't federal employees so they don't think we're at the trough and they're getting lesser. I was thinking of all sorts of phrases that probably ought not to say on the record. But the fact is that they're not getting as much. Because if we don't, whether Republicans, Democrats, pro-government, anti-government, or anti-government in the sense we want to see government small, I don't care how big government is. I mean, I think there's certain things we ought to do, but that's not the issue. If we have a small government, we ought to have few employees. If we have a large government, we want to do a lot of things, we're going to need more people. They're not at fault. We hire the people that we think we need to do to get the job done. And if we think we need to go into the field with Army and Marines, we hire more Army and Marines. If we need more food inspectors or more NIH researchers or more CIA intelligence officers, we hire more of them. We don't need them, we don't hire them. That's not the issue. But we need to show them respect, and we need to pay them comparably. Not more than the private sector, but comparably, so we can compete. Mr. Chairman, I would hope that we would allow the Van Hollen Amendment, which substitutes focusing on what we have not addressed this year, and that is not doing this sequester. It is dangerous for our security. General Dempsey said that yesterday. Secretary Panetta has said that. I believe it to be the case, but it is also dangerous to our economy. So I would ask you to allow the Van Hollen Amendment in order, and I would urge you to not support the freezing of this half point for the last 6 months of this fiscal year. And I thank you for your generosity.